Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. Thank you for joining us tonight at Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. I'm Morgan Wurzberger. I'm the head of development here at the library, and we are joined by Linda Hervieux, author of our book, Forgotten, The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes, and Commissioner Raymond Kemp, Senior Commissioner of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Tonight, Linda and Raymond will be in conversation for about 45 minutes. Afterwards, we'll open it up to questions from everyone here and on Zoom and that camera right there. So please think up some good questions. And then afterwards, we will be having a book signing. Books are available for sale in the Turner Commons. So I would like to say that we're 2 weeks away from D-Day, so it's quite a privilege, or from the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and it's quite a privilege to have both of you here with us tonight. My wife, as some of you know, works for American Battle Monuments Commission, and through her work, I've had the privilege of visiting some of these cemeteries and monuments that commemorate the service and sacrifice of Americans in World War I and World War II. And these sites are beautiful, they're incredibly powerful, and they really tell, or they're part of the story of the 250-year friendship between France and the United States. I know a lot of people know about Normandy American Cemetery, but there are also, I believe, 24 other sites in France, and there are 2 just outside of Paris, so I hope everyone has an opportunity to go visit one of them soon. On that note, our speakers tonight are Linda Hervieux is a Paris-based American journalist whose work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the New York Daily News, and the Daily Beast. She is a teacher who has lectured about the forgotten African Americans of D-Day and World War II at many universities and at the National African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The Men of Forgotten will be featured in an upcoming episode of National Geographic and Disney Plus series Erased, World War II Heroes of Color, which comes out June 3rd, I think, June 2nd, very soon. Commissioner Raymond Kemp Sr. is a U.S. Navy veteran who culminated 33 years of service as the Fleet Master Chief of Europe and Africa. While on active duty, he served 6 presidents and completed 11 combat deployments. He is the founder and CEO of Kemp Solutions, a best-selling author, and an executive coach. And in 2021, he was appointed by President Biden to the American Battle Monuments Commission. So can we please have a round of applause for tonight's speakers.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and just a big thank you to the library. I was here last in February 2016 for the launch of the book, and I did not think I would still be speaking about the book this many years later. But as you can see, World War II is still very much on our minds and on our screens, and so it's been exciting. Thank you to everyone on Zoom and everyone here who's come. A lot of you were here in 2016, and also especially to Commissioner Kemp, coming from Dallas just for us, leaving tomorrow. So thank you for coming. And
certainly a pleasure to be here. It's my first time here at the library. Very, very excited to take a moment and to take it all in. As a combat veteran, I understand the importance of the support that may not necessarily come from comrades on the battlefield, but those who support us either nearby and certainly from home. So truly, truly my pleasure to be here and have this very important discussion this evening.
thank you for leading it.
And so I'm going to ask some questions that hopefully you all want to know. There will be a Q&A afterwards, but I have had my opportunity to make my way through the book, Linda, and I will admit, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert for those who haven't gotten the book yet, hopefully you will tonight. Chapter 4, Chapter 5, Chapter 9, and Chapter 3 were my favorites. Tell you right now, they shook, my core one way or another. either because of a personal lived experience through my family or through my own military service and experience in the American society. And so just a quick soundbite to kind of help you understand what that means is I was born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, born in the great nation of Texas, and raised in Oklahoma, where I joined the Navy at 17. So when I say lived experience, I was, as a child of the 60s, that means that I had an uncle and grandparents that were actually in World War II and at D-Day. But my first question for you, Linda, is would you tell us about what drew you to write this book about the Black Americans that participated in World War II, particularly on D-Day?
Well, there's a lot of episodes in the history of this book and the history of African Americans in the military where we can thank France, and this is one of them. So in 2009, for the 65th anniversary of D-Day, where the French government really pulled out all the stops. So President Obama, the Queen, the German Chancellor for the first time, all kinds of VIPs were here. And the French government chose one American to honor with the Legion of Honor medal, and that was an American named William Garfield Dabney. This is Bill. You might recognize the man on the next to him. So Bill shook the hands of Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg at Invalides when he received the Légion d'honneur, and he had no idea who they were. His son had to say, Dad, do you know who these guys are? Bill knew he was being honored for being in D-Day's only African-American combat unit. He knew that unit was written out of the story of D-Day. Common wisdom was that there were no African-Americans at D-Day. Bill also knew their movie, Saving Private Ryan, showed no black soldiers, though it did show their barrage balloons, which we'll get into. And for Bill, Bill is just a charmer. He was the baby of this battalion, 89 on this day. And this is him wearing his Legion of Honor medal in his backyard in Roanoke, Virginia for me. And the story I wrote about Bill, a lot of reporters did. A lot of us had no idea the U.S. Army was segregated in World War II. A lot of us had no idea what a barrage balloon was. We didn't know any of these stories, and on the ride back from Normandy, a lot of the reporters, we were all talking about why is it, the Americans especially, why we don't know any of this history. And that started it. And it seemed a shame to just do one article, and friends who are wiser than I, who are journalists in New York, said, that's a book. One friend in particular, magazine writer. And through him, I spoke to an agent who said, you should pursue that. And then 5 years later, we had a book.
So you mentioned how many people within the reporter group that just didn't know that history. What were some of the challenges that you faced as you were preparing and writing out the book, particularly if you encountered some challenges when it came to just getting information that, regrettably, most of the American public is just not public knowledge or common knowledge?
Well, these men were written about in specialist books, but not in any great detail. Finding military records was a huge challenge. So this is the only known photo of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. That's Bill's battalion on Omaha Beach. And it's a good representative of the challenges faced because it's the only photo. And only 1% of Army records from World War II were kept when I started the research. And archivists in the National Archives tell you that all the time as just a warning. Okay, just know that what you're looking for Only 1% of Army records are retained. And so it was very hard to find a trail for these men. It was very hard to find names of the other men in the battalion. Bill had not kept in touch with any of them. And so how to find names? There's no rosters in the Army kept in the records. How were we going to find names? And a couple of journalists and I said, you know, they always retain financial records. Why is that? You know, follow the money. And so in St. Louis, Missouri, there are payroll records for the 1940s Army. And I picked the group that went to Britain in 1943 because that was the group that was going to D-Day. And we picked through hundreds and hundreds of names, and with the help for the retired librarian of the New York Daily News, where I worked, and the databases of the Daily News, thank you, Daily News, we were able to find 12 men who could give interviews, and the families of many, many more, some of whom are on Zoom right now watching. And yeah, we were able to construct the story, so.
You know, relevant relationships are so important, and so I'm very glad that you were still connected to those folks, particularly the librarian who gave you access to that information. How about some of maybe some surprises or some little-known facts that you came across as you were pulling up the information? As a service member who did combat tours, I can imagine some of the challenges when it comes to finding names, but pay records, I mean, that was brilliant. Whoever's idea that was. Let's celebrate them.
That's journalism school, everyone. Maybe, I don't know. Well, I mean, one of the reasons I did this book, I mean, I'm a white woman with a typical Northeast Massachusetts education, and I hadn't heard these stories. There was a general line of outrage running through all the research as I discovered how bad the segregation was, how bad the racism was, how racist policy was baked into the US military and Army studies, pseudoscience. At every layer, separating these men and relegating most of them to service and labor battalions because they were deemed not smart enough, not courageous enough, not good enough, it was outrageous. And it was also outrageous that I didn't know any of this history, or very little of it. I knew what Jim Crow was, those series of laws across the South that ensured total separation of the races, but I didn't know the details of that. And Chapter 5 of the book is called "We Were Like Little Dogs," which is a quote from one of the men in the book, because that is how they felt at their training camps. So that was a motivator, and that was a shock. And on a lighter note, the balloons. I mean, what were those crazy things all about? I mean, we'd never heard about them. The British reporters all knew. Because they were flying over London, where they're not effective in protecting a city. They're very effective in protecting a beach or a defense plant. And they had been flying along the US border after Pearl Harbor, from the Mexican border all the way up to Canada. In many spots on the East Coast, when there was still concern Germany would develop a long-range bomber and bomb the East Coast. And so I learned about the barrage balloons, and that was fascinating to me. And that's one of my favorite chapters, is the balloons.
The story about the little dogs, that's from one of my chapters. The men were going through training, and every now and then you'd get R&R, that's rest and relaxation, or maybe a 4-day pass, depending on how long you might have been allowed off the base. We still get those, by the way. And they made their way into Memphis, down to Beale Street. So those of you who have maybe had a taste of, and I use that term intentionally, a taste of the South. Memphis, not only known for their barbecue, but also for their blues and what have you. They went from the base into Memphis looking for what the Navy would call liberty, but again, that same rest and relaxation. And one of the things that they discovered is that some of the bars that they were not allowed into because they were white only, that the prisoners of war, known as the Axis prisoners, those of the Germans and others, were allowed into those bars and in various other places. So the prisoners were allowed into the places that those who were in combat were not allowed. And I underlined the quote in the book, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, but basically one of the men reported that our enemies are allowed to come in and dine, but we who are defending our nation are not. And so it was a very interesting, troubling time for blacks in the United States during that era. As we look at the impact of the book, what would you hope that Forgotten would actually create when it comes down to the current understanding of World War II?
Well, my hope would be that, because I've still heard not long ago that there were no black soldiers at D-Day, I mean, my hope would be that World War II, like the rest of history where people are omitted, will be more inclusive. All right, we've seen progress in the United States with this, and we've also seen in recent years a step back from that progress. When you can't mention slavery in schools in the United States, what can you do with that? And why is it important that the men of D-Day, the African American men of D-Day, are included in that story? Well, D-Day was arguably the most important day of the 20th century, according to many historians, because Eisenhower and his generals knew if they could get those men onto that beach and up and over those bluffs, it was only a matter of time so they would be marching to Berlin. And to exclude a significant portion of the US population from that epic day does the United States and its history a tremendous disservice. And so my hope is that, you know, documentaries like the National Geographic Disney Plus documentary that's coming out. There's a Netflix movie coming out by Tyler Perry with Kerry Washington playing the 688s, but playing Charity Adams. I have a picture somewhere in this slideshow, I'll find it. And she was an amazing woman, and she led the only African-American female battalion that fought overseas and that traveled overseas, and they were in charge of untangling millions of pounds of mail. And their stories combine not only racism, but sexism. So it's a double whammy for them, as some of their vets said in many interviews. So.
If I could just hang out at 6888 just for one quick second, I had the opportunity to go to one of our facilities and meet with Tyler Perry and Kerry Washington. For some of you who may remember the show Fame, the director, she was also one of the folks that was part of the film. And having the conversation about that, untangling millions of pounds of mail, we talked earlier about how Linda was able to go through the library and through the financial records and pick out names, particularly names that were very distinguishable. But in those days, if your name was William, your name wasn't William, your name was Bill or Billy. Or if your name was Robert, you weren't Robert, you were Bob or Robbie or something to that effect. And that's the way the letters were written. And so imagine trying to find the Robbie, who's also Robert Smith, or Jones, or Williams, or one of those common names. And so the effort that they were able to square away that mail within half the time that they were allotted, I believe they were given 6 months, they actually did it in 3. The ability to do that took a Herculean effort. And then you take the fact that they were black women, the things that they had to do to manage their hair, and then the feminine challenges as well. An amazing group of folks. But it's very common, I think, to what would generally be known as the Black diaspora, able to be resilient and able to overcome challenges that they are facing, which is why I think this book is so important, is because it should serve as a measure of inspiration for everyone, by the way, not just Black people. Because if they could endure the challenges that they went through at home and then in the war effort, surely we, with the few things that we're going through, could also be resilient and strong and able to overcome and be fabulous in what we do when our challenges are just very different than theirs, though they are challenges. For a minute, 6 AAA, I'm pretty excited about them. I'll tell you more. Yeah. Oh man, what a great photo. There's just one more aside. There's another lady in that image. She's the third from the right. She was with us, Ed, when we were in New York reviewing a stage play, the commission. There's 11 of us total, and so we were in New York having the opportunity to review a play. And she was there, and her daughter, granddaughters, and nieces had no idea who she was in the war effort. And so that, I think, and perhaps we'll get to that later, is a reflection of the modesty that was practically forced upon the Black community in that era that we're talking about during World War II.
It's always hard to get you veterans to talk about the war. Journalists who would cover D-Day ceremonies or Memorial Day or Veterans Day, it was always difficult to get veterans to tell stories. Veterans don't want to talk. And the African American veterans I met all said, well, who cares about what we did? It wasn't even recorded. It was very painful to the men in the battalion that they were not considered part of D-Day. So.
Yeah, and I'm guilty, by the way. We had this conversation last night, and I was thinking, I've never told, my grandson about some of the things that I've done, and even my children actually came across it through happenstance. So I will commit myself to doing better. There's certainly some things I will never tell, but then there's the things that are unclassified and safe and fun. Perhaps I'll share those things. Oh my goodness. So can you, again, as I made my way through this, there's so many stories, but can you share with us maybe a moving or inspirational story that exemplifies the courage of these men?
Well, I think most of you know who I'm going to pick. I mean, I'm close to so many of these men, but we have to go to Waverly Woodson. So, candidate for the Medal of Honor even today, new effort to get him one. So, there were so many stories, but Waverly Woodson, who I didn't have the honor of meeting, he passed away in 2005, but Waverly Woodson was a pre-med student in West Philadelphia when he signed up in December 42 for the Army. He didn't wait for a draft notice. And he trained as an officer, but like other Black officers, they were limited by quotas. So, and also the rule that they could not lead white men junior to them. So there were no officer posts, commissions available for him, so he retrained as a medic, and he was assigned to the 320th. And that's what he was doing when he was approaching Omaha Beach with a few other medics. This battalion landed with the infantry. They were full combat soldiers up until the small arms fire was taken care of on the beach so they could get their balloons up, which we didn't talk about the balloons, which provided a protective curtain, if you're wondering. They were flown from the ground, and they had little bombs on them. Anyway, he was a medic, and he was injured on the approach to Omaha. He was he came in the early morning, and a shell hit outside his landing craft, and shards of shrapnel rained on deck, killing a lot of men, and he was wounded. His inner thigh and buttocks were sliced open. He thought he was dying. He was patched up. He got off that landing craft following a tank that was blown up in front of him, and he set up a first aid station on the shingle, these apple-sized little white stones on the edge of the beach, and there was no cover from the German snipers in the bluffs of Omaha. If you've been to Omaha, you know how steep those rocky cliffs are. It's still picturesque even today, and that was deadly if you were a soldier coming into that beach. And so he worked for 30 hours, and he amputated limbs, dispensed blood plasma, and on June 7th, 30 hours later, after one last burst of heroism, saving a line of British soldiers who were foundering and drowning coming into Omaha, he collapsed. He went to a hospital ship. He asked to come back to the beach. He was back on the beach 3 days later. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor. No black soldiers in World War II got the Medal of Honor until 1997, when Bill Clinton awarded 7 of them. Waverly Woodson's records are missing, and just to 1% of Army records retained. His are gone, and we don't know the trail, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that's in the book. We've built a good case. The First Army in Illinois, which ran all the troops in Normandy on D-Day, their historian has volunteered for 2 years, the last 2 years, tracing my records, trying to find more. And we have a great case, and it's on the Secretary of the Army's desk right now, and we'll see what happens. So that is my story to pick, but it's hard because there were so many stories. Yeah.
There truly were. And if it's okay with you, can we go back and just perhaps for those who have not had the opportunity to hear Linda speak before, or perhaps you haven't had a chance to see the book, and just talk just briefly about the balloons and maybe some of the details behind how they worked and the train, or whatever you feel would be useful.
So you saw this picture on Omaha, the only picture that we have. We don't know who the men are. They were certainly the 320th. They were the only Barrage Balloon Battalion, American battalion on Omaha and Utah beaches. So they worked in balloon crews of 3 and 4. They raised these balloons on a winch. You can see it more clearly in this demonstration. The balloons went on the road in 1942 to get money for war bonds. And so you can see the stitching. Bill Dabney described them as about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. They're about 125 pounds. And they were filled with hydrogen, which is highly, highly combustible. And so these men had to learn to make hydrogen. It's actually quite easy. We could maybe do it in this kitchen back here. It's not hard. It's a chemical reaction, I learned. But the Navy balloons, no offense, were pretty safe. Those were full of helium, which is a safe gas. And the balloons you see that were flying over the ships were Navy balloons filled with helium. These were different. These could be inflated on the beach using hydrogen, canisters of hydrogen. And so their job was to fly 2,000 feet over the beach, hiding in the clouds, attached to steel cables with little British-designed 4-pound bombs, about the size of a Coke can. Bill Dabney said he talked in images all the time. And a cable strike by a plane would send the balloon down on a parachute system. And a good hit could take out the wing or explode the gas tank, but simply the cable alone could stall the planes. And German pilots were terrified of them. And really good disinformation campaign by the Allies made them very scared about what would happen if they hit those cables. And so there were all sorts of stories floating around. No pun intended, that what would happen if you hit the cables. And so yeah, that's the balloons in a capsule. So
Yeah, those balloons. I mean, just imagine, flying that aircraft, and if your responsibility as a pilot is to get low and strafe, right, fire, at those troops on the ground to slow them down, or even if you had a small bomb, trying to get down the danger, of. And I think I read they heard that the cables were, you get electrocuted, if you hit the cable. But shucks, I'd be more afraid of that bomb that came up from that canister than being electrocuted, because I'm inside a plane in a rubber. But that's just me. Fortunately, they were very, very effective. And I'll tell you, it makes me proud to know that these men who got no glory for what they did still, did their job with vigilance and were able to be a key part of the landing. I'm truly thankful that you took the time to highlight this story, because I've known some stories in my career and in my life just from my parents and through my family, but this one was very special to me, and I just didn't know. And I wonder what has been the reaction, particularly from not just certainly from regular readers like me, but also from the family members of those who you've been able to tell this story. What type of reaction have they been given?
Well, the family members are all special and wonderful, and it's thanks to them that I was able to get enough information. Any of the historians I talked to about World War II and D-Day said to me, you can never go by memory alone. So even if they remember, you can't use that. Everything has to be checked. And there's only so far you can go. I mean, there's, 1,000 endnotes to this book explaining the nuances of the history and what we could get and what we could not get. This photo, which is a group of 320th men in Cherbourg, is by George Davidson, top left. Unfortunately, George's son, Bill, who single-handedly put this battalion on every single Army-linked website that you've ever heard of, and passed away. He was a Vietnam vet, part of a long class action suit against Agent Orange exposure. George took a lot of photos. He was the clerk of this unit, and he took a lot of records, kept a lot of records, and it's through George that we have a lot of photos of this unit. On my website, there's a button on the top called 320th with a gallery of all the men, and you can click and get more pictures. And it's thanks to Bill Davison giving me those pictures. Another family that I should highlight is Wilson Monk. Wilson and Martina, wonderful, wonderful people. And this is the church in Wales where Wilson was billeted with the other non-commissioned officers from this battalion, who got a little bit of a better accommodation than all the others who were across the street in the tents in the field. It looks exactly like it did, as it did in the war, this little town called Abersocken in Wales. Lovely, lovely town where these men were stars. Imagine 600 African-American men coming off a train in this small village in Wales that had never seen any person of color before. And all they could think of was, Hollywood has come to town. And all of the kids who remembered them not only responded to a newspaper article they wrote saying an American journalist was looking for people who remember the black soldiers. They came to every single event in Wales, and they just wanted to share their stories. The BBC ended up doing a documentary called Black and British, with one episode on the American GIs, just quoting all of these people from Wales and their stories. And so Wilson was taken in by a woman called Jessie Pryor, whose son was off in the British services, and he became their second son. And the letters between Jessie Pryor in Wales and Wilson Monk's mother in Atlantic City, he was the only one who had a big bag of documents from the war. He handed me a big bag of letters and said, here you go. And that was how I was able to construct a lot of what they did in Wales and in Oxfordshire, their first stop in England, where they were treated everywhere they went like the heroes that they were, people who came to help the British. And they were welcomed, and they were really just made parts of the families with connections that lasted for years.
You know, the letter from her to Wilson's mother, I mean, that gave me pause. You know, just thinking that this family, you know, who had come across him in this military effort, they made such a relevant relationship that they shared letters between them, and that was, I'm so glad that you did that. And when you get your copy of the book, make sure you dig into the epilogue. I'm so thankful for the things that happened afterwards. Would you like to mention something, maybe?
Well, I just want to say this is mostly a social history of U.S. segregation and racism, written from the perspective of somebody who didn't know this history. And so what was surprising to me were the children of many of these men who not only didn't know their dads were at D-Day, but also didn't know how bad their dads had it, because their fathers did not want to tell them how bad Jim Crow America was. Their dads didn't want them to have that baggage. And that was so interesting to me to learn that, say, Wilson Monk was telling his story for the first time 50 years later. And, you know, one thing to remember about all of their stories is the history that we have today. I mean, who records our history? Who are the historians? If more people are not recording history, if more people aren't asking the questions, that history is going to be lost. I keep thinking of Bill Davison from Vietnam, the Vietnam War, George's son, and how, you know, thankfully someone in his family told me that we had lost him, because he was my weekly correspondent. And he would have loved to have known that this book is a documentary. And there's also an active film option that we hope will get made too. So hopefully, because they all took the time, the story will keep getting told, and also the bigger story of World War II, which brings me, before we run out of time, U.S. Navy. So the Army had, the Navy and the Marines were terrible places to be if you were a serviceman in the early days of the war. Most African Americans were in the Army, but the first hero of the war was Dory Miller of the Navy, and he is in episode 1 of that documentary. And so Dory, many of you know his story. He was a messman doing laundry, and when the sneak attack happened and his ship, the West Virginia, was hit, he dragged the mortally wounded commander out of harm's way and then jumped behind a gun he'd never been trained to use and started using it, and took out a couple of Japanese planes by some accounts. The Army wanted to keep his role a secret. And it was the pioneering, dynamic black press that made his name finally come to light. He was given the Navy Cross, which was 3rd place at the time. The mortally wounded commander got the Medal of Honor. Yeah, so tell us about how the Navy evolved from that time.
Have we evolved?
So how much time do we have? Only in a couple of minutes, then we have...
I'll tell you the interesting story about Dory Miller, and let me just get to the happy ending, and then I'll go back to his story, right? The happy ending is that the Navy has named their first aircraft carrier for not only the first enlisted person, but a black enlisted person, and it's Dory Miller. He happens to also hail from the great nation of Texas. Something little known, though, is we all call him Dory. That's his nickname. His real name is Doris Miller. And so if you see or read it someplace, it's the same person. The nickname is Dory, so that's what we call him. The fact of the matter is true. The commanding officer got the highest recognizable military award, which is the Medal of Honor. Some stories depend on, anecdotally speaking, he was in position he wasn't giving orders. He was just trying to live. And Doris snatched him up, tossed him over his shoulder. Dory's a big guy, kind of like me. Tossed him over his shoulder, carried him to safety, then jumped on that gun and went to work. The inspiring thing for me and others about the Dory Miller is that, one, we realize that, our gift will make room for itself. If you're courageous, your courage is going to come out. If you have been trained to do something difficult in trying times, it's not a measure of thinking about doing it. When you're resilient, you just do it. The great thing about training over and over, train, and retrain, is what the Army taught me, though I'm a Navy guy. What I've learned is that when that happens, again, as a combat veteran of over 11 combat deployments, then I don't react. I don't have to think in a combat zone. I just react because I've trained for it. And thankfully, these men that we're talking about today not only trained within their professional competencies, they also trained to see what else was going on because they were curious, they were intentional about their learning, and they were patriotic. And so those three things, I think, created space for them to be great. And I'm very glad that we're able to recognize them now. The Navy was very slow when it came down to integration and celebrating. In fact, I would challenge the Navy, and I hope you're watching, I would challenge the Navy that we should be better about who it is that we celebrate. People like, what's the first Fleet Master Chief who was black, his name was Chuck Anderson. I mean, we should be lifting and celebrating. The first woman who was a Fleet Master Chief, the first black Fleet Master Chief, Navy Europe, Navy Africa, practically unknown. And so I think that even now we are still challenged when it comes down to recognizing and celebrating those who are worthy of celebration. Again, part of the happy ending is that we have seen all of the ranks open up. Dory Miller was, as you mentioned, a messman, and those ship servicemen, those people who were only ironing clothes and cooking food and doing KP duties, all of those jobs opened up ultimately during my tour during my service time, which started in 1986. So very recently, have all jobs been open across the board. The Navy has been slow when it comes down to integrating women as well, because it was only in 1993 that we allowed women on board combat ships. And if I could just jump to the happy ending, the most senior person in uniform in charge of the entirety of the Navy now is a woman. And so I think that there's still strides that are being made, but how far back is the next woman to be in competition? Though we've still never seen a black senior enlisted person in the Navy, the only service that hasn't had that. And we haven't seen a black senior member of the Navy either. So there are still a ways to go. But in the era that we're discussing now here during World War II, those ship servicemen for the Navy was the only opportunity. The other services, Army and the Marine Corps, allowed black men to fight in the combat roles. I'm certainly thankful for that.
And just one last word for France, since we're here. It was thanks to France that the second Legion of Honor medal was given to a man in this battalion in 2013 at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. This is Henry Parham from Pittsburgh. Great story, Henry. Sad, but great story. And Ethel, wonderful Ethel, is still with us. We lost Henry on Independence Day in 2021. And so.
Well, I think with that, can we have a round of applause for our speakers tonight? Nice spot to end. We can open it up to questions. So if anyone has a question here in the room, I will bring you the mic so that everyone on Zoom can hear you. Anyone have a first question? Someone in the back.
Hi, that was really interesting. I'm just curious about why things moved fairly quickly after the war, because by Korea the Army was integrated, from what I understand. by 1950? Like, was it just Truman's doing on his own, or?
Oh, not on his own. That's a great
Yeah.
question, Greg. It's because of Isaac Woodard, actually. So in 1946, a soldier returning home in uniform on a bus going to Georgia needed a bathroom break in the South, and where they stopped, there wasn't one for colored. And he said to the bus driver, "You need to find another colored bathroom." And the bus driver, they had words. And at a future stop on the way, there was a group of a sheriff and some other cops who beat him so severely that he was blinded. And photos of him, Sergeant Woodard, in uniform with bandages around his eyes, went nationwide and horrified everybody, as those photos should. And Truman finally said, "We got to do something." The Army might have been the, in quotes, best place for a black serviceman at the beginning of the war, but the Army came along far later than the Navy and even the Marines by the end of the war. And so eventually an executive order was issued to desegregate the Army, but it would be 2 more years, not till 1948, when the Army was fully desegregated, meaning the last all-black unit was dissolved. And when I say all-black unit, that means the enlisted men and some of the non-commissioned officers, but it does not mean the top officers. They were always white.
No, that's interesting. That's still pretty quick considering just how rigid they've been during the war.
Well, that wasn't the only horrifying bit of violence to come through, because just like the African American soldiers coming back from World War I, the soldiers coming back from World War II were also set upon in the South, and the plague of lynching that would, shake the country when people finally learned these details. 50 years of a war against African Americans. A lot of these veterans were set upon, and the violence was horrific. And so there were many episodes like this, with Isaac Woodard being the pinnacle in many people's minds.
And if I could also offer that, well, first let me say, I said Chuck Anderson. Chuck Clark was the first Black Fleet Master Chief in the Navy. But what I'd also like to offer is that it may seem fast, from this leisurely seats that we sit in here in 2024. But that journey was far from easy, as Linda said. That's with the stroke of a pen, okay, now the military is, fully, desegregated, on paper. But the maltreatment still continued in a ferocious way. And I'd say even before Truman inked that paper, it was Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, hey, men and women in the services, this is a war effort. They can certainly be contributors. And it was Eleanor Roosevelt who encouraged the first all-black guided destroyer escort ship. It was named USS Mason. And they had an all-black crew, performed in a tremendous way. And just a quick soundbite about them, or the impact that they had, is that the U.S. Navy names current day guided missile destroyers after sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen who perform at an extremely high level. But there's one ship in the U.S. Navy today, and the only one to date, that has been named for a crew, and it's the USS Mason, DDG-87, which was named after this all-black crew because of the heroic efforts that they had performed during a destroyer escort mission that they had back in the 40s. And so, though it may seem like it was quick that transition took place, but not only in Korea, also in Vietnam, where there's still a high level of disparaging treatment towards blacks across the services. And even in 1986, when I joined the Navy, reported to my first ship, the way the Navy works is when you get assigned, then you meet the person in charge, and they disperse you to your particular profession. I was a information systems person. And when I met this guy, and I just walked into his office, and in his office was the Confederate flag. We call it the Stars and Bars. And over his left shoulder, my right, was the burnt orange and cream flag of the Texas Longhorns, which is a university football team. The spirit in Texas is high. So I walked in, seeing the Confederate flag and this flag, and I thought, oh, I'm comfortable because that's where I'm from. You know, I mean, I grew up crossing the street, you know, when somebody else who looked like most of you guys was walking down the street, I crossed the street because I know that was the culture of the time. I knew not to look people in the eye because I was taught not to, be disrespectful and so forth. So I walk into his office, it's good. And he told me that we don't allow y'all in the computer room. By y'all, you realize there's this term in the American language that is so polarizing that we don't even use the word. We just use the letter that the word starts with. Can you imagine? But in 1986, the residue that these men had gone through, certainly in a very different way, I even endured. And so this may seem like a historical event, but it's really upon us because I'm with you. It's really something that we're still currently enduring. And so though it may seem like a quick amount of, oh, they're back, 1950s, no, it was not a measure of equality, much less of inclusion.
Any other questions? Hold on.
Oh, we got to have that. Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating conversation. Really great. I'm curious, do you know if any of the black soldiers who landed at D-Day made it to Paris? And did they have a different reception here than they were used to?
Not the men from the 320th. The men in the 320th stayed on the beaches for 140 days. Squads went up the coast to liberate the ports, and then they went back, and then they were sent to the Pacific. So they were also the only black unit that served in the European theater and the Pacific theater. The war ended when they were in Hawaii, Camp Punch Bowl. Fun pictures come out of that one. Wilson Monk couldn't stop talking about Camp Punch Bowl. And where they were headed, the war ended. But there's speculation they were headed to a land invasion in Japan. Speculation. But did other black soldiers come into Paris? There were so of the 2,000 soldiers that landed on D-Day, others were in port battalions that were unloading ships under withering fire. We've all, I hope, heard of the Red Ball Express. They're mostly African-American truckers who brought supplies from the coast to the front lines. Were any of them part of the liberation? I don't know. I've not seen pictures with African-American faces in the liberation. But I do know that everywhere in the world they were, outside of their own country, whether it was Britain, whether it was occupied Germany, whether it was the Pacific, they were treated much better. And we were speaking about this last night, how sad it was when they came home and expected everything to be better. And there were two lines coming off that ship, white and colored. And they knew, okay, well, nothing's changed. And so these experiences collectively among the 1 million African Americans in uniform would help lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement that was coming.
Do you feel that the African American Museum in D.C. has paid due attention to this issue, especially what you're bringing up about D-Day?
I was one of their very first speakers. They invited me right when the book came out. I had met the director in the green room of a TV station who said, well, yes, of course you're coming to the museum. The day after the election, 2016, by the way. And they have these men memorialized, and they have World War II memorialized. And if you've not been to this museum, it is extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. Could they have a bigger exhibit to these guys? Sure, sure. But no, we're grateful that there's recognition now, because there wasn't always, and they weren't always part of World War II exhibits. So
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, Linda. So it's a not well covered part of history, but part of the problem is most people I talk to don't know anything about World War II, period. So we've got a real problem in the country with basic historical education, and this is part of that. I mean, this may not be your field, but how do we get there? How do we get the basic education on World War II where it needs to be?
well, if I could design the core curriculum for American schools, you would learn all about this. We could collaborate. No, this is, by the way, Ed Ryan, the executive director of the ABMC. They run the Omaha Beach and the American Cemeteries Abroad and Monuments. And thanks to Ed, we have this presentation tonight with Commissioner Kemp. How do we protect our history? How do we get the word out among young people? The more I read about the battle going on, the cultural battles in the U.S. going on over correcting our history in schools, the more it becomes apparent that we're going in the opposite direction in many states. There really is a huge divide. How do you get kids interested in this history? Well, you can take them to France and bring them to the wonderful visitors center at Omaha Beach. You know, you can take them to Arromanches at the circular 360 movie about D-Day in the British sector. But what can you do? Well, maybe movies like this, directors who think it's important to tell this story. There's another documentary that's going to be coming out that's looking for money now by a British filmmaker about the search for mixed race, half African American, half British men looking for their families and their fathers and their grandfathers. And it's fascinating. And a lot of those sons and granddaughters have been in touch with me through the years when the book came out, thinking, do you know how we do this? And now with DNA, will we have some of those answers? But how do you do that? That is a very good question, Ed.
I think one way, if I could offer it, is that something that we probably could do more often. I mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, she was really good friends with a woman named Mary McLeod Bethune. She was a African-American educator in days gone by. In fact, the Bethune-Cookman University in Florida is named after her. That relationship was important. Mary Pat Kelly is the author of a book called Proudly We Served, about the men of USS Mason. She was instrumental in getting the ship named for that crew. And also, Linda, I would say, is someone who has highlighted something that should have been part of our culture from the beginning. What I'm talking about is allyship. I'm from a community where we believe firmly that things will not change until those who are not impacted are offended. Things will not change until those who are not impacted are offended. And so that allyship, from my perspective, Ed, is something that if we all commit to leaving here and telling someone about this story, telling someone not only about the World War II in general. I'm a sailor, so the sailor's battle in the Pacific is certainly partial to me, but about the World War II, I think we could, and the heroism and the reason that we call those folks the great in America, the greatest generation. I think when we tell that story appropriately, then we can create a measure of patriotism where they too would continue to seek to learn more. And then not only could we take the lessons learned from our history, but then build upon it and certainly become a more altruistic and intentional society around the world.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have a final round of applause?